And welcome back. We are now at the point where we can start adding additional features into our game. If you recall, we have a climbing animation that we have existing, but we haven't actually set anything up for it. So let's go ahead and jump right into doing that. First thing I want to do is, back in my tile map grid, I have a couple different tile maps that I can use here. However, the best thing to do when we start encountering things that we want to climb is actually to create a whole new tile map for that. So I actually want to come in here and actually create a whole new tile map that I can go ahead and work with. Otherwise, we're going to have to be really finagling here. So this is going to be the best option for us, is to go ahead and actually make that tile map. So again, we're going to go down to 2D object and we're going to choose a tile map. And of course, we have a couple other options. We're going to check with our rectangular, since that what we have been working with, and we're going to call this our climbing tile map. There we go. And now that that's set up, we can go ahead and work on a couple other things that we need to just kind of get everything set up for a foundational level. So the next thing we want to do is come over here to our layers, and let's go ahead and add a layer. And there's actually two things we're going to do here. First, we want to create a user layer here. So let's go ahead and call this our climbing layer, just so we can have that. And in our sorting layers, we're actually going to want to add a layer for that too. So let's go ahead and call that our climbing. And if you think about it, we want that to appear below the player. So I'm going to move that up a level, because we want it so that when it is in the player object, we want them to climb on top of layer, not be behind layer. Unless you, of course, you had some sort of thing where the ladder is going to be passing in front of them. But we don't really want that here. We want it so the player's in front of that ladder based upon how our sprites are set up. And you notice I didn't drag it all the way down. I left it above the platform. You might have some arguments for different things, but for now we're just going to go ahead and say the ladders are going to be on top of that platform layer. And so let's just go back to our climbing tile map. Make sure we go ahead and tag that. So we want to make sure we have a climbing layer. And then of course we have to make sure we have our sort order and everything checked. So if you notice down here we have sorting layer. It's on default. We want to change that to our climbing layer. And so now in my climbing tile map here, we're going to go ahead, let's head down to our sprites here. And what we want to do is have these be in such a manner that we can go ahead and access the ladder. So we're just going to drag the ladder up and in. All right, we're going to get a pop-up here saying, where do you want to save this asset? So let's go ahead, make sure we put that in our tiles here. And we can just, of course, call this our ladder asset. That's perfectly fine. So we just hit save there. And now we, have, of course, have a ladder that we'll be able to use. And of course, remember the ladder was just one single sprite. There's nothing else to it. So it's a pretty easy thing for us to work with. And you see when I click on it, you can see we have the ability to start adding ladders. So let's go ahead and place some ladders here into our world just to see how they're working. I'm just going to go ahead for our purposes. Let's just go ahead and place our ladder right here. That's perfectly fine. I'm just going to put a couple in there, and you can see there's our ladder, nice and rendered in there. But there's a couple other things we need to do here with our character courses. If we think about how we had our platform tile map, remember we also had a composite collider 2D and a tile map collider 2D, because we have to have some kind of collider for this for the player to actually kind of interact with it. So I'm going to go back to this, and let's go ahead and add in those components. So I want a collider. So here's my composite collider 2D. There's that. And we also want our tile map collider 2D. Because again, we want the player to have those interactions that otherwise it doesn't do much good to kind of place that into our world. It's just fancy decoration. Now, one thing you'll notice with our collider, it looks a little funky here. All right? It doesn't quite look like a rectangle as we might expect it to. So what we actually need to do is go over to our ladder sprite here, and we actually need to kind of edit the collider for this actual sprite here. And so let's go ahead and do that. So with our sprite selected, we're going to go right over to our sprite editor. And we want to go to custom physics shape here. So it's the third option down. And what we want to do is set this so that way it's pretty much over this kind of border that we have here. And once we have that selected, we of course can start putting those pieces in here. Now you notice there's none in here right now. So we might need to add that in. So let's just hit generate. And now that we have that generated, we can go ahead and start snapping this into place here. And we're just going to bring this in here, undo that, and we'll bring that corner in. And notice I'm not putting it right on the edge because I don't want it to be where the player character is kind of scudding along the edge. So I brought it inside just a little bit. And I'm not going to want these inner pieces here because, again, the player is just going to effectively just move over this whole thing. I'm just going to make sure my edges are all nice and square up as much as they are. Then once that's done, let's go ahead and apply that shape there. And then we can go ahead and close out of that. And let's go ahead and look back at our map. It's going to ask me, do you want to save this? Yes, let's go ahead and save that. And we may have to update this tile map collider here a little bit just to get the right viewing. Now we're going to pop over to code real quick and add a method that's actually going to allow us to perform that climbing action. So let's go ahead and make a climb ladder function here. So open close parentheses. Of course, we get an error. We're just going to go ahead and accept that so we can generate that method. Boop, there it is. And we'll take that throw statement out of there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this climb ladder here, just so it's near where my other kind of movements are. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut that out just real quick here. And I'm going to go ahead and put that here where I have like player run and player walk, because I think that would be good so all my kind of movement pieces are all with each other. So now if I look at these, if you recall, we had a vector 2 that allows us to control kind of the left direction, right direction through their player velocity. And I think that's a good starting point for us. So we don't have to kind of retype our whole code, because effectively we're going to be able to move up and move down our ladder, right? And so we're going to, of course, have some changes here, but they're going to be a different kind of change, right? So we want, of course, to change effectively what we're doing, right? So before we are moving left and right, so now we're going to be moving up and down. So what we want to do is, of course, check these values here and effectively flip them around. So I'm just going to actually take, first thing I want to do, of course, changes from the player velocity. Let's just rename this to climb velocity, just because it's an easy way for us to keep this from getting mixed up in case we need to start referencing things. And I'm just going to go ahead and replace those two values there. And then what we want to do is look at our player velocity, player rigid body dot velocity y, and I'm going to actually move that to here, and I'm going to just change that from .y to .x. And I'm going to take my movement input .x times player speed. I'm just going to cut that, and I'm going to move that to here. And what I want to do is, instead of movement .x, I want to make it movement .y. And I don't want that to be the player speed anymore. I want to make that the climbing speed. Now, I haven't defined what the climbing speed is yet, but let me just talk about that real quick. So effectively, we're taking our movement here that we had, and we're going to keep that x direction, so that means we're not going to be changing it. And we're instead going to change our y direction based upon a climb speed value. So how fast do we want our player to move the ladder? So I'm going to come up here, and we're going to just have to add in another serialized field. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's add a serialized field. And we're going to go ahead and make this a float value. And we're calling this our climb speed. And let's set this one to, I'll make this a little bit slower. Let's make this one like 2F just to start. And we can, of course, change it in our inspector to get to a value that we want to be. Now, one thing to keep in mind, we only want to climb the ladder if we are touching a climbing layer. So we had done something similar to this when we, of course, did onJump. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and just copy the first part of this if statement here. So I'm just going to copy that. And let's go back up to our climb ladder. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste that if statement in and add some curly brackets here. And you can see it's saying, oh, I don't know what I want. It's just complaining because I don't have enough curly brackets or parentheses here. So now it's nice and happy. Now, one thing I do want to keep in mind here, because this was the player capsule collider that was touching layers. But remember, this was for the ground layer. And this time, we don't want to have it on the ground layer, because otherwise it's not effectively going to change anything here. Instead, what layer do we actually want this to be on? Well, if we think about what is the layer that we just created, this would be our climbing layer. We want this to be on the climb layer. So if it happens during climbing layer, that's going to allow us to do things. So I'm actually just going to take this code I just wrote and stick it up inside of this if statement. Make sure everything's all tabbed over so it's real nice looking. And so it's saying, hey, if this is actually true, if you're actually touching the climb layer, then you can do these things. Otherwise, we're not going to worry about it. But again, because you notice there's nothing that's going to happen here if this statement does not become true. So that's a pretty cool thing. We should be able to test this out now. And so let's just give this a quick test. And here goes our player, and he's taking a nice little walk, and he's going along, poop, oh, and he knocked the ladder right on in. That's not quite what we want, so obviously we need to go ahead and adjust some things. So the one thing we got to do to go ahead and fix this is we got to make sure our rigid body was set to dynamic, and so we need to actually make this a static, because remember, static is what's going to keep that from being unchanging. And so then if we go ahead and run our game, Our player can come along, do. Oh, and he still can't quite climb it. So obviously there's a little bit more work of what we need to do. All right, and so the other thing that we need to fix is, of course, we have it stacked down, but we need to add in a trigger to this, because remember, triggers allow us to pass through our object without actually kind of running into them. And of course, we have two options. We have the composite collider 2D. If we hit that, that might do it, but actually, if you think about it, because it's a tile map here, we actually need to look at the tile map collider 2D, and you can see we have an is trigger option there. And so now if we go ahead and run our game, here goes our player character, and they're falling into a world. Let's have them kind of come up to our ladder, and notice now we can reach that. Oh, and we can climb up it. Now notice we are still using the kind of idle animation, so that's one thing we'll have to adjust. And of course, we're also kind of sliding back down this ladder. So again, that's another thing we might have to adjust, is kind of this sliding action that we have going on. But we can now, of course, climb ladders, and we can use that to create new areas to our map.